to pay for this. You know, we're giving it to you. Bog-offs, sales, free gifts. You know, Staples, there's two companies, my company uses Viking Direct and Staples. And recently, I've noticed we've been doing a lot more business with Staples than Viking Direct. They're both very good companies. Why? I said, why are we doing Staples? Oh, well, they're giving away, like, televisions. Or they're giving away, you know, DVD players, and all the office staff want them. So we've swapped, you know, I mean, it's nonsense, because obviously we're paying for it. But nonetheless, any way in which you can diffuse the insula and say to them, and soothe the insula. And so when the medial cortex, the frontal medial cortex, makes the decision, do I go with the insula's excitement or the with the nucleus accumbens excitement or the insula's caution? Where should I do it? And here we'll be showing you in a minute in some studies which we've done on how people respond when they're not certain what to do. So these are the four components, and I deal with them in much more detail in my paper: time, attention, trust, and affordability. And you mustn't always think that it's the cheapest chips is the best way. There was a very interesting study which I'll conclude with, where they actually put people in an fMRI scanner, which takes a kind of a photograph of the brain. Which from a market research point of view sounds good, but it has a lot of problems with it. You have to lie very still. It's a very noisy, claustrophobic environment. And what they did was they let them sip wine through a straw. And they gave them exactly the same wine. In one of the studies, they gave them exactly the same wine. It was the same, exactly the same. And it was actually a $90 bottle of wine. But the first group of people were told it was a $10 bottle of wine. And the second group of people were told it was a $90 bottle of wine. And those who tasted a $10, what they thought was a $10 bottle of wine, thought it was blanc. They didn't like it at all. Those who had exactly the same wine but believed it was worth $90 thought it was the most delicious wine they'd ever tasted. So very often, you know, price is not necessarily a barrier. In fact, price can be a big sales advantage in some cases if you're selling a high prestige item. Right, I'm going to hand over now to Ian, who will take you on to the second part of the journey.
Okay.
Do you want the major mic?
No, I'll just...
Okey-dokey.
Because in the same way that telling people about the price of a bottle of wine influences their perception of it.
You need that. Sorry, you had got to recording
that.
it.
Oh, right, okay. Excuse me a minute, guys.
Here.
So in retail, we can change people's perceptions of what they're buying, the experience they're having in retail, by making that retail experience a $90 experience as opposed to a $10 experience. And I think within the retail industry, we're beginning to see a lot more of that happening. We have lots more technology that's enabling retailers to create interesting experiences. So you might just have caught it, it's not on a loop, but there's a floor projection technology there that actually sort of makes flowers grow as people are walking over the floor. Another example of how changes to a retail environment can influence behavior is a case study from an American in-store design agency called Miller-Zell. Miller-Zell were commissioned by a company called the Glazed Ham Company in New York to revamp their store. The Glazed Ham Company essentially did a huge trade during Thanksgiving, where they do these sort of premium whole hams that are all nicely glazed and mustard and honey and all of those sorts of things. But all of that process went on in the back room. And what they found was they had a very, very seasonal trade. Miller-Zell changed the whole situation from an in-store point of view and brought the glazing of a ham right into the center of the store and put all sorts of condiments and things like that around the outside of that and made it into a theatre experience for people, which drew people in across the entire season. And so as a result, the Glazed Ham Company did an awful lot more trade. But even in more sort of basic retail environments such as supermarkets, we're beginning to see retailers embracing the idea of creating enhanced experiences. And I think Walmart is a good example of that. It was mentioned earlier. And Joe Tapper here, the Vice President for Store Presentation at Walmart, very much sort of saying, we're about making experiences, we're not just about stacking up products and selling them anymore. So experience is something that retailers are beginning to embrace. That's all very well, but how do we go about measuring experiences? How do we go about understanding how people are responding? when a lot of this, as Christina said, is very much subconscious, sort of the 95% of what's going on in our brain every day. What our belief is in order to do that, you need to go into real environments. We need to be measuring, if you like, subconscious brain activity in context, immersing people in experiences in a natural way in order to develop a true picture of how they're responding to the environments rather than being always in a lab. Now, obviously, David touched on this right at the very beginning. One of the key things in order to achieve that is having a frame of reference. When we're measuring brain activity, that doesn't really mean an awful lot unless you understand what it is that somebody is engaged in at that point of time. And there's two key ways of doing that, as David explained. There's an ICAM, which is a general field of vision that helps you to understand, okay, well, which fixtures are people looking at, whether people are in the process of navigating as opposed to engaging with product, for example. And then there's the more specific eye-tracking technologies that allow us to say, at this point in time, this person is looking at this bottle of Heinz tomato sauce on the shelf. Dependent on what it is that we're trying to achieve, we choose one or the other of those reference frames. Is it going to move on? Yeah. But when we're talking about taking technology like EEG, so the measurement of brainwaves, out into the real world, we also have another particularly significant issue to address. And that is an issue which is technically known as artifact, but in essence it's noise within the data. And that noise is a result of, if you imagine you've got electrodes on your head, those things are moving about as you're walking and as you're sort of engaging with your environment. And also your muscles are contracting and relaxing, which also create electrical activity, which creates noise over the top of any pure signal of electrical activity that's going on in the brain. So we need to look at ways of actually resolving that as an issue. One of the first ones is actually try and prevent it as much as possible. Make sure you've got good electrode contacts when you're capturing EEG signals in an ambulatory situation. Post-data capture, we can also employ algorithms to clean that data, to recognize, if you like, signatures of noise within the data and clean that out. But ultimately, at the moment, the technology isn't in a position where we can completely clean the full EEG data set. So there are always occasions where we have to cut chunks out of that. Magically. We have to cut chunks out of that data. So we are in a position where we have to discard a certain amount of data. Now, what we as a business did with the Mind Lab at the back end of last year was really an exploratory piece of work to try and understand what the potential is for measuring brain activity in a real shop situation, what the barriers were, whether this is something that's actually realistic. So although I'm going to be showing you some results at the moment, these results are not conclusive results that actually you can apply to everybody and this is necessarily what is going on, but nevertheless they are indications of some of the things that are possible. So we took one individual around an uninterrupted supermarket shop. We tracked their eyes, we captured their brain activity through QEEG. We did a certain amount of post-data capture sort of cleaning and things like that. We filtered out visual fixations to make sure that we weren't concerned with very, very fleeting fixations that actually don't give the brain any chance at all to engage with what the visual stimulus are. We coded the fixations that were left in terms of the nature of them, whether or not people were looking at products, whether they were looking at signs, whether when they were looking at products, those products were products they ultimately went on to buy or they didn't. We also processed the EEG data. What we found was, going back to data rejection, we had to throw away about 30% of the data altogether. Now, across a 30-minute shopping trip, that means that sort of, 10 minutes of that data was actually unusable. But we still had 20 minutes left that we could use. So 70% in our view wasn't too bad from the point of view of actually looking at what was possible.